You're kneeling on stone. It's cold under your knees, damp, gritty, worn smooth in places by hands that aren't yours. The air smells like crushed sage and something older. Around you, shallow graves, bones wrapped in flowers, seashells pressed into the earth where someone's chest used to be. Your hands are caked with grain paste. You're grinding it, mashing wild barley into a basin carved straight into the bedrock. The grain is turning to mush. It's warm. It's starting to smell sweet. You're making beer, or bread, or both. Honestly, at this point in history, 13,000 years ago, the difference between the two is basically a nap. Let it sit, you get a buzz. Bake it, you get dinner. And you've never planted a seed in your life. Nobody has. Not yet. Not for another 3,000 years. The version you were taught goes like this. Farming came first, then bread, then, much later, beer. The evidence says the opposite. The oldest bread on Earth is roughly 14,400 years old, made by hunter-gatherers, 4,000 years before the first farm. And the oldest claimed beer? You're kneeling in it. A cave full of the dead. One scientist calls it a brewery. Another looked at the exact same stones and called it a bakery. We'll show you both sides. And there are several layers to this, each one stranger than the last. The deepest one isn't about beer or bread anymore. It's about you. It starts with 24 blackened crumbs pulled from a fireplace in the Jordanian desert. Here's the version of history most people carry around. Somewhere in the ancient Middle East, people settled down, planted seeds, invented farming, and farming gave them grain, grain gave them bread, and eventually, much later, beer. Bread is the staff of life. Beer is the luxury that came after. That story has one problem. It's backwards. The oldest bread like food ever found was pulled from a fireplace at a site called Shubeka 1 in the Black Desert of northeastern Jordan, roughly 14,400 years old. Archaeologists recovered 24 charred crumbs, tiny, blackened fragments, and put them under an electron microscope. What they found was a flatbread, dense, unleavened, made from wild einkorn wheat mixed with ground-up tubers from a plant called clubrush. It's not a baguette. Nobody's spreading butter on this thing. But structurally, microscopically, it is bread, made from wild grain, by people who had never farmed a day in their lives. And domesticated crops, those don't genetically lock in until roughly 10,500 to 9,000 years ago. This bread predates agriculture by about 4,000 years. You think farming gave us bread. It's the other way around. We had the bread first, and then spent 4,000 years figuring out the farm. But if foragers were already baking without fields, without farms, without even a permanent home, then where was the grain coming from? The people who made that bread weren't farmers. They were Natufians, fully modern humans, anatomically identical to you, living in the Levant, the strip of land running through modern-day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, right at the end of the last ice age, when the hills were thick with wild grasses, wild wheat, wild barley, dense, natural stands of it, growing on its own. Free groceries, basically, if you know how to harvest it. And they did. They cut those wild cereals with flint-bladed sickles, small, curved tools with tiny stone teeth set into bone handles, carried the grain back to camp, ground it on heavy stone slabs, baked it. They weren't wandering aimlessly. Either, they were semi-sedentary, staying in the same places long enough to bury their dead in the same caves, generation after generation. Cemeteries, grinding stations, a system. These people had a routine. Not a farm, but not random either. But here's where the story pushes deeper, because the Natufians weren't even the first to grind grain. At a waterlogged site called Ohalo 2, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, archaeologists found a grinding stone caked with starch from wild wheat, barley, and oats. Next to it, what looks like a baking installation. The date? 23,000 years ago. Let that land. 8,000 years before the Natufians. Deep in the Upper Paleolithic, glaciers still covering northern Europe. Someone picked up a rock, crushed some wild grass, and made something edible. 23,000 years ago, people were processing wild cereal into food before the Ice Age was even over. The technology for bread, and potentially for beer, existed long before anyone thought about planting a seed. So, bread existed before farming. The tools go back even further. And now the question underneath all of this finally surfaces. If they could bake, could they also brew? Hold that. Because in about 3 minutes, another scientist is going to look at the answer and disagree with it completely. In 2018, a team of researchers announced something that made headlines everywhere. They'd found evidence of beer, the oldest beer on Earth. The site was Rakfet Cave, on Mount Carmel in northern Israel, a Natufian site. roughly 13,000 years old, carved into the bedrock floor, 3 stone mortars, deep, rounded basins, hollowed out of the living rock. The team, led by Lilu of Stanford, scraped residues from those mortars and analyzed them. Starch granules from wheat and barley, showing signs of a very specific process. Malting, mashing, fermentation. Here's the recipe, roughly. You take wild barley. Soak it in water until it sprouts, that's malting. Sprouting converts the starch into sugars. Crush it, mix with water, heat it, that's mashing. Then you wait. Wild yeast, floating in the air around you, because yeast doesn't need an invitation, lands on the sugary liquid and starts eating. It produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. That's beer. Or at least, the beginning of beer. Now don't picture a cold pint. This wasn't golden, wasn't clear, wasn't carbonated. Ancient beer, if that's what this was, would have been a warm, cloudy, thick porridge like mush, low alcohol, maybe 2 to 4%. You could almost eat it with a spoon. Less cold one after work, more boozy oatmeal someone left out too long. But the real story wasn't the beer itself. It was where they found it. Reykjavik Cave isn't a kitchen. It isn't a camp. It isn't a bar. It's a cemetery. Beneath that cave floor, beneath and around those stone mortars, are Natufian burials. Bodies laid on beds of flowers, sage, mint, figwort, dusted with seashells, arranged with care. They buried their dead here and came back to do it again and again over generations. And right there, in the middle of the graves, they were brewing. The team didn't just say someone made beer here. They said this was ritual beer, brewed for funerary feasts, gatherings held in the presence of the dead. Think about what that means. 13,000 years ago, people standing in a cave full of their own ancestors, mashing grain into stone basins, bones beneath their feet, flowers wilting in the dark, making something that would alter their minds, together in the company of the gone. The first beer was a funeral drink, not a party, not a happy accident, not someone left their grain out and oops, a deliberate act of remembrance. And that changes everything. Because if beer wasn't born out of boredom or thirst, if it was born out of ritual, grief, the need to gather and feel something together around a body, then here's the question that rewrites history. Did wanting that, the drink, the gathering, the ritual, push people to do something they'd never done before? Did the craving for beer help invent farming? In 1953, a botanist named Jonathan Sauer asked a question that rearranged an entire field. What if grain wasn't first domesticated for food? What if it was first domesticated for beer? The anthropologist Robert Braidwood turned it into a formal symposium with, and this is real, one of the best titles in the history of academic publishing, Did Man Once Live by Beer Alone? The panelists noted something interesting. The earliest domesticated grains had tough husks, called glooms, that stuck to the seed. That makes grinding into flour a nightmare. But it's not a problem if you're soaking and fermenting. The grain, they argued, was better suited for beer than bread. They ultimately called it improbable. But the question, like a good beer, refused to go flat. Decades later, archaeologist Brian Hayden picked it up. His argument, in forager societies becoming more complex, more competitive, more hierarchical, you built alliances and gained status through feasting. Big, lavish, come one, come all feasts. And what supercharges a feast? Alcohol. Always has. Always will. If you needed more grain for more beer to impress more people, harvesting wild grass wasn't enough. You needed to produce more. Control more. Eventually, grow it on purpose. That's the feasting hypothesis. Competitive feasts, fueled by beer, may have pushed foragers to overproduce cereals, and overproduction, over enough generations, nudged wild grain toward domestication. It's elegant. It fits the evidence at Reykjavik, ritual brewing, communal gatherings, the dead is the occasion. But, and this matters, it's a hypothesis. Respected, influential, not proven. The desire for beer is one possible engine among several. Climate shifts, population growth, sedentism, all feeding into each other. Still, the idea that civilization might trace back to someone wanting to throw a better funeral feast than their neighbor, that's hard to forget. And it leads somewhere uncomfortable. If farming didn't start because people were desperate for food, if it started, at least partly, because of ritual, or status, or the buzz, then was it even worth it? We can actually read the answer, in bones. When farming took over, when communities shifted from foraging a varied diet of wild plants, game, nuts, and fish to relying heavily on cultivated grain, the skeletons changed, not for the better. At Adelhike, one of the earliest farming settlements in central Turkey, bioarchaeologists studied hundreds of skeletons spanning generations. Early farmers were shorter than the foragers before them. Shorter, their teeth were riddled with cavities from starchy, high-carb grain diets. Infectious disease markers spiked. Nutritional stress increased. This wasn't just one site. Across the Neolithic transition, the same pattern repeats. A landmark review found the shift to agriculture was consistently associated with a decline in health, stature, and dental condition. Trading foraging for farming was like trading a varied buffet for a grain monopoly. And your skeleton paid the bill, in cavities, in lost inches, in disease. So here's the uncomfortable math. If farming was partly driven by the desire for bread, beer, and the feasts that bound communities together, then we traded health for something else. Something social. Something ritual. Something that mattered enough that our ancestors were willing to get shorter and sicker for it. That's not a dumb trade. That's a profoundly human one. Now, remember those 3 stone mortars I told you about? The ones the headlines called the world's oldest brewery? Here's where we need to be honest. This video would be irresponsible if it skipped this part. One scientist looked at the rewrote residues and called them beer. Another scientist looked at the exact same residues and called them bread flour. Same stones. Same data. Brewery or bakery? Pick one. David Item published a direct rebuttal. His argument: those mortars weren't for brewing. They were for milling barley into flour, for bread. The wear patterns on the stone, the shape of the starch granules, the whole setup, he reads it as a bakery, not a brewery. Li Lu's team fired back, defended the fermentation signature, the specific way the starch had been altered, signs of enzymatic breakdown, consistent with malting. The debate went back and forth in the same journal, never resolved. And it gets worse. Remember Göbekli Tepe, the famous site in southeastern Turkey? Massive stone pillars carved with animals, roughly 11,000 years old, built before permanent villages? Archaeologists found giant limestone troughs, some holding up to 165 liters. The first interpretation, ritual beer, brewed in bulk to fuel the feasts that built the world's oldest temple. That story went everywhere. Beer built civilization. Then, in 2020, a new integrated study, same site, more careful analysis, concluded those troughs were mostly used for cooking cereals, porridge, gruel, not beer. The narrative quietly deflated. One more thing worth sitting with. The earliest chemically unambiguous fermented drink we've found isn't from the Levant at all. It's from Jiahu, in central China. A 9,000-year-old rice honey fruit concoction confirmed by chemical residue and pottery. Real, certain, no debate. And the earliest rock-solid barley beer? Göbekli Tepe, Western Iran, about 3500 to 3100 BC. A jar with visible beerstone, calcium oxalate crusted into the grooves. Undeniable, so the certain barley beer is roughly 5,500 years old. The claimed beer is 13,000. That's a 9,000-year gap between maybe and definitely. The deeper you push beer into the past, the softer the evidence gets. That doesn't mean the Natufians weren't brewing, it means we can't prove it yet. And maybe we never will. Some things the earth just doesn't preserve. That honest uncertainty, that's the actual answer. And it's more interesting than a clean headline. Here's where it lands. On the hard evidence we have today, the stuff you can hold, scan under a microscope, and date bread is older, by about 1,400 years. Shubeko 1, 14,400 years old. Rakefet Cave, roughly 13,000. Bread wins the race. But the race was never the point. They share the same recipe, same grain, same grinding stones, same process, splitting at the last step like a fork in the road. You mash wild barley and bake it, bread. You mash wild barley and wait, beer. Siblings, not strangers. And both were made by hunter-gatherers who had never planted a seed. Both predate agriculture by thousands of years. Both existed before villages, before pottery, before fields. So did ancient humans invent beer before bread? Probably not. But we genuinely don't know. And here's why that's the interesting part. The question assumes bread and beer were two separate inventions. They weren't. They were two outcomes of the same experiment. An experiment that started when someone, 23,000 years ago, picked up a grinding stone and crushed wild grass into something edible. The line between the two may never have been clean. It blurred every time a batch of porridge sat too long in the sun. The real answer isn't beer or bread. The real answer is, someone, a very long time ago, looked at grass and saw food. And from that single impulse, grind, add water, heat, wait, came everything. Bread, beer, farming, feasts, cities, the world you live in. All from grass. Think about the last funeral you went to, or a wake, or just a night when people gathered around a table because someone was gone. There was food, probably a drink. Someone raised a glass, not because they were thirsty, Because it felt right. Nobody taught you the toast. Nobody explained the bread on the table. It just felt like what people do. Gather, eat, drink, remember, 14,000 years ago. In a cave in the Levant, people were doing the exact same thing. Grinding grain, making bread, possibly brewing something warm and cloudy and just strong enough to change the mood. Sitting together in the presence of the dead. Eating, drinking, remembering, different cave. Same reflex. Your cavities are partly a Neolithic inheritance. The spike in tooth decay tracks directly with the shift to starchy grain diets. Every loaf you've ever eaten descends from those charred, dense tuber and einkorn flatbreads baked in a fireplace in Jordan. Every beer you've ever cracked open follows the same malt mash ferment chain that someone may have used in a cave on Mount Carmel, surrounded by bones and sage. The recipe forked 14,000 years ago. You're still eating both halves, because you are the product of people who looked at wild grass on a hillside and saw something no other species has ever seen. Not just food, possibility. They figured out how to turn grass into bread and a buzz before they ever figured out how to plant it. They ground it, baked it, fermented it, shared it over the graves of people they loved, and they wanted it badly enough that, over thousands of years, the wanting itself may have reshaped the world. The loaf on your counter, the glass in your hand, the moment at a funeral when someone says a name and everyone raises a drink. That's not modern. That's a 14,000-year-old reflex you inherited from people who were exactly as smart as you, exactly as hungry, exactly as human, standing in a cave, turning wild grain into something worth gathering for. Every loaf, every glass, every time you raise a drink to someone who's gone. That's not culture. That's memory. Older than farming. Older than civilization. That's you.